In the winter of 1862, the Lakota Sioux faced a blizzard so fierce it threatened to claim the lives of everyone in its path. But one man, Kaya, knew the land's secrets well enough to turn this deadly storm into a chance for survival. Before we begin, share where you're watching from. And if you're ready to hear a story of survival against the storm, subscribe, because tomorrow's tale runs deeper than this one. The wind howled through the vast, snow-drenched plains of the Northern Territories, rattling the windows of even the sturdiest cabins. It was the winter of 1862, a season marked by fierce blizzards and the cruel grip of the cold that seemed to seep into the bones of all who dared to face it. In the heart of the valley, nestled among towering pines and ancient oaks, there was a small, hidden settlement, a place untouched by the chaos and noise of the world beyond. It was here that Kaya, a member of the Lakota Sioux tribe, had lived for most of his 32 winters. The storm had arrived without warning, catching the settlers in its furious grip. Kaya had known the signs. He'd seen the way the birds moved erratically that morning, the way the winds spoke in whispers that warned of an impending fury. He had spent much of his life listening to the land and its warnings, growing up with the knowledge that nature was never to be ignored. The elders of his tribe had taught him to respect the earth, the sky, and the seasons. And now, standing at the edge of his village, Kaya could feel the storm gathering strength. He could already hear the distant rumblings of the wind as it swept across the valley, carrying with it the first flurries of snow. It would not be long now before the storm would break in full force. Kaya's heart quickened, but his mind remained calm. He had seen such storms before. In fact, his people had weathered storms much worse than this one. The difference was that they had always been prepared. Today, Kaya was not only concerned for his own survival, but for the survival of his entire family. As the storm began to pick up, he made his way toward his hidden winter room, a sanctuary that had been passed down through generations. This small secret shelter, carefully concealed within the earth, had protected his ancestors through the harshest of winters, and Kaya had no doubt that it would do the same for him now. The winter room had been designed not just for warmth, but for the wisdom it held in every log and fur lining the walls. The shelter was built deep into the earth, its walls lined with layers of animal hides and insulating materials that would keep the cold at bay. Kaya had spent countless hours reinforcing it, ensuring that no matter how fierce the storm, his family would remain safe. It was more than just a room. It was a connection to his people's past, a living testament to the ingenuity and strength that had carried them through generations. As Kaya approached the entrance, the wind began to howl louder, pressing against him like a force determined to push him back. But Kaya was unshaken. He had weathered many storms in his life, both the physical and emotional, and knew that survival was a matter of preparation and resolve. The door to the winter room was small, hidden behind a thick layer of snow and earth. As he carefully pulled back the cover, Kaya glanced over his shoulder toward the village. The rest of his family was already inside, waiting for him. Kaya stepped into the shelter and sealed the door behind him, feeling the warmth of the room envelop him like a soft embrace. Inside, his wife, Ahuli, and their 2 children sat near the fire. The warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the howling storm outside. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft orange glow on the walls, and the scent of burning wood filled the air. Kaya's children were already wrapped in furs, their eyes wide with excitement and curiosity, their young faces lit with the anticipation of the storm's arrival. Ahuli looked up as Kaya entered, a relieved smile crossing her face. "You're just in time," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the wind outside. Kaya nodded, pulling his thick fur cloak tighter around him. "The storm will be fierce," he said, "but we are ready. We will endure it, as our ancestors have done." The wind had grown more forceful as Kaya sealed the door to the winter room. Outside, the blizzard raged in full fury, its icy tendrils clawing at the earth. Inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around Kaya like a shield. The crackling hearth provided a constant, comforting sound amidst the howling storm. Kaya's children, Naya and Dakota, sat huddled together near the fire, their wide eyes reflecting both the flickering light and a sense of awe. It wasn't often that they got to experience such a violent storm from the safety of their shelter. Ahuli, Kaya's wife, moved gracefully across the room tending to the fire. Her steady hands worked without pause, adding more wood to the flames, ensuring they would burn brightly through the long night ahead. Kaya watched her with quiet admiration, for she too was strong, shaped by the same resilience that ran through his veins. Together, they had created a life that, although simple, was grounded in the knowledge of their ancestors, knowledge passed down through generations and rooted deep within the land. "Father," Naya whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar, "will the room hold?" Her young face, barely 10 winters old, looked up at Kaya with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Kaya smiled softly and knelt beside her, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. "Yes, little one," he replied gently. "The room was built for storms like this. The earth keeps us safe, and the warmth of the fire will keep us strong." Dakota, who was just a few years younger than Naya, leaned in eagerly, his small hands grasping the furs that lay over his legs. "Tell us again about how the room was built, Father. How does it keep the cold out?" Kaya's eyes softened as he looked at his children. He had taught them about the winter room many times before, but each time they asked, it reminded him of the immense wisdom of their ancestors. The winter room was built deep in the earth, with thick walls of stone and wood. The entrance is hidden, so the wind cannot find us. The layers of fur and hwadasi hides keep the warmth in, and the smoke from the fire rises through a crack in the stone, carrying the scent of our hearth. Naya's eyes sparkled as she imagined the room's creation. Did the ancestors really know how to make it so warm? Kaya nodded. "Yes, my daughter. They knew the land better than anyone. Every part of the room was designed to withstand the harshest winters. This is the wisdom we carry with us." The storm howled louder outside, its fury now seemingly reaching its peak. But inside the winter room, the family sat in quiet solidarity, knowing they were safe. Kaya's gaze shifted to the doorway, the sound of the wind muffled by the thick stone walls. He could feel the earth's strength beneath him, grounding him in the timeless bond between his people and the land. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow on the walls of the winter room. Kaya sat cross-legged near the hearth, watching the flames dance as they consumed the dry wood. His children, Naya and Dakota, had already fallen asleep, their breathing steady under the thick furs that covered them. Kaya smiled as he watched them. They were safe, just as he had promised. Ahuli sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap as she gazed into the fire. The light flickered across her face, revealing the strength and wisdom in her eyes. Kaya knew that, like him, she had learned to survive through the trials of the land. She had seen hardships, but her heart had remained strong. "We are lucky," Kaya said softly, breaking the silence. "The room is holding, and the storm outside is not yet through." Ahuli nodded, her gaze steady. "We have the warmth of the fire and the shelter of the earth. We are safe here." Kaya glanced at the walls of the winter room. The structure had been carefully crafted, a sanctuary hidden deep within the earth. The thick stone walls were lined with layers of animal hides, each one placed with care to provide insulation. The roof, constructed of overlapping branches and thick fur, had been reinforced with earth to keep the cold at bay. Kaya had spent many hours ensuring that every detail was perfect. He had known the winter storms would come, and he had prepared for them with the wisdom of his ancestors. The room was a testament to that knowledge. The ancestors had always known how to live in harmony with the land, understanding its rhythms and cycles, respecting the power it held. The winter room was not just a shelter. It was a connection to the past, a way of preserving the old ways and ensuring that future generations would survive. As Kaya sat by the fire, he reflected on the teachings of his elders. They had always spoken of the importance of preparation, not just for survival, but for the preservation of culture and knowledge. The winter room was more than just a place to escape the cold. It was a place where the family could gather, share stories, and pass down traditions. It was a place where the future could be shaped by the wisdom of the past. Kaya reached out and placed his hand on the warm stones of the hearth, feeling the heat rise through his fingertips. The fire was their lifeline, just as the land had always been. In times of danger, it was the fire that kept them alive, the fire that connected them to the earth and the ancestors who had come before. As the wind howled outside, Kaya's mind wandered to the future. The storm would pass, as all storms did, but the lessons of the land would remain. The winter room was their safe haven, but it was also a reminder of their place in the world, a reminder that they were never truly alone. The storm raged outside, its fury growing as the hours passed. Inside the winter room, Kaya and his family sat in peaceful silence, the crackling fire providing both warmth and light. The wind howled through the trees above, but the thick stone walls and layers of insulation kept them safe. Kaya gazed at the flames, his thoughts drifting back to the day he had first helped build this shelter. He had been a boy then, barely 12 winters old, when his father had taught him the art of constructing the winter room. It had been a long and grueling process, but Kaya had learned well. The winter room was built to withstand the harshest conditions, its structure designed to trap heat and keep out the bitter cold. Every stone, every log, had been chosen for its strength, and each layer of fur and hide had been carefully arranged for maximum insulation. As the fire burned low, Kaya felt a deep sense of gratitude. This room, this sanctuary, was more than just a shelter. It was a symbol of his people's resilience, their ability to adapt to the harshest of environments. It had protected his family for generations, and it would continue to do so long after he was gone. Ahuli moved silently beside him, adding more wood to the fire. She worked with quiet efficiency, her movements practiced and sure. Kaya watched her for a moment before speaking. "The storm is fierce tonight," he said, his voice low. Ahuli nodded, her eyes soft. "It will pass, as they all do." Kaya smiled, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. He had lived through many winters, but there was something about this storm that felt different. The winds were colder, the snow heavier. It was as if the storm was a force of nature, bent on testing their survival. But Kaya would not let fear take root. He had prepared for this moment his entire life. His people had survived countless storms, and so would they. He turned to his children, who were nestled together on their furs, their faces calm in sleep. They were safe, and that was all that mattered. The firelight danced across the walls, casting long shadows that flickered and shifted. Kaya felt a deep sense of peace as he watched his family, the warmth of the fire washing over him. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the rhythm of the storm outside to lull him into a light sleep. But sleep was fleeting. A sound broke through the silence, a soft thump, as though something had brushed against the wall of the shelter. Kaya's eyes snapped open, his senses alert. He held his breath, listening. The storm outside seemed to pause for a moment, the silence heavy in the air. And then he heard it again, a scrape, something moving in the snow outside. Kaya's heart pounded as the scrape of something against the shelter's walls reached his ears again. The wind outside howled louder, but the noise that had drawn his attention was not from the storm. Kaya rose slowly, his body moving with practiced caution. He didn't want to alarm his family, but something had disturbed the quiet of their sanctuary. Ahuli looked up at him, her eyes full of concern. She knew Kaya well enough to understand that when he moved with such intent, it meant trouble. "Stay here," Kaya whispered, his voice low but firm. He moved quietly to the doorway of the winter room, pressing his ear to the thick stone wall, listening intently. Outside, the storm still raged, but the scraping sound had stopped. For a moment, the only sound Kaya could hear was the wind, howling, as it swirled around the trees and across the snow-covered ground. Then it came again. This time, the sound was louder, a distinct scratch as something heavy dragged across the earth. Kaya's muscles tensed. He stepped back from the door, his eyes scanning the dimly lit interior of the winter room. His children slept soundly, their faces peaceful and unaware of the threat outside. Kaya turned to Ahuli, who was now standing beside him, her face pale, but composed. "I need to check," he said quietly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ahuli nodded, understanding the necessity of his actions. She moved to the fire, adding more wood to keep it burning brightly. The warmth filled the room again, but Kaya's mind was far from comforted. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Kaya opened the door just enough to peer outside, the cold air rushing in immediately. The wind stung his face, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the darkness beyond, where the snow swirled in thick, blinding sheets. Through the storm, he could make out the faint outline of something large, a shadow moving against the blizzard's force. A bear. Kaya's heart skipped a beat. The bear was large, its fur thick against the snow, its powerful body moving slowly but steadily toward the shelter. Kaya had seen many creatures in his life, but this one was different. The size of the bear, and the way it moved, deliberate, purposeful, made his skin prickle with unease. He closed the door quietly, making sure not to disturb the room's stillness. Inside, Ahuli looked at him expectantly. Kaya didn't need to say a word. She knew from his expression that danger was near. "The bear is near," Kaya whispered, his voice steady, "but it hasn't seen us yet." Ahuli nodded, her lips pressed tightly together as she thought quickly. "Should we move?" "No," Kaya replied, shaking his head. "We wait. If it comes closer, we'll use the fire." But Kaya knew deep down that there was no guarantee the fire would be enough to keep them safe. The storm, the cold, and now the bear. Nature was testing them, and the answers were uncertain. The bear's presence outside weighed heavily on Kaya's mind, but it was the cold that gnawed at his resolve. The wind's fury had not abated. If anything, it seemed to grow with each passing hour. Inside the winter room, Kaya could feel the chill creeping into the very bones of the shelter. The fire flickered weakly, struggling to push back the cold that clung to the air. Kaya looked over at his family. Ahuli sat close to the fire, her face drawn but her gaze steady. The children, wrapped in furs, slept soundly, unaware of the dangers outside. The storm had become a relentless force, its howling winds carrying with them the weight of nature's fury. The fire was their lifeline, but Kaya could feel it weakening. He had carefully managed the fire, adding wood whenever it began to die down, but even the thick logs he had stacked weren't enough to keep the room fully warm. The air inside was growing colder, and Kaya knew that they couldn't afford to let the fire go out. If it did, they would be lost. He turned to Ahuli, his voice low and urgent. "We need more wood. The fire won't last the night." Ahuli nodded, her expression somber but resolute. She knew what needed to be done. With steady hands, she rose and moved to the small pile of wood near the entrance. Kaya watched her for a moment, his thoughts racing. They had enough firewood to last through the night if they used it wisely, but it was uncertain how long the storm would last. Could they survive the worst of the blizzard, or would they be buried in the deep snow by morning? Ahuli returned with more wood, placing it carefully on the fire. The flame surged for a moment before settling back into their steady crackle. Kaya sighed with relief, but it was fleeting. The fire would not be enough if the storm didn't let up. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, and Kaya could feel the cold creeping into his fingers and toes. He moved closer to the hearth, the warmth radiating off the fire, and pulled his cloak tighter around himself. But even the fire's warmth wasn't enough to push back the gnawing cold in his bones. The storm continued its assault on the world outside, a constant biting wind that seemed to push against the shelter itself. Kaya stood silently, listening to the howling wind, and for a moment he felt the weight of the world pressing in on him. The winter room, their haven, had been built to withstand the worst storms, but even the strongest shelter could be tested by nature's wrath. Kaya glanced at Ahuli, who gave him a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We'll make it through," she said softly, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. Kaya nodded, his resolve hardening. They had to. They had no choice. The wind continued to rage outside, its fury unchecked as the night stretched on. Kaya sat by the fire, his thoughts heavy with the storm's power. Inside the winter room, the warmth from the fire flickered weakly against the chill that seemed to creep into every corner of the shelter. The storm had become a silent, ever-present witness to their struggle for survival. Yet Kaya remained unshaken. He had prepared for this. Ahuli moved silently about the room, checking on the children, her eyes full of concern, but also a quiet determination. Kaya could see the exhaustion in her features, but there was no fear. She was strong, stronger than even the storm outside. She had known hardship, and she had faced it with grace. Kaya admired her for that. The fire crackled, casting shadows across the room. Kaya watched the flames for a long moment, mesmerized by their movement, as though they too were struggling against the storm. The warmth from the fire felt comforting, but insufficient, and he knew they couldn't let it die down. Outside, the wind howled with even greater force, its shrill cries slipping through the cracks in the shelter's walls. The snow had piled high against the entrance, and Kaya wondered how much longer the storm would last. The shelter was built to withstand the harshest winters, but even the sturdiest shelter could only endure so much. Kaya thought back to the lessons passed down from his elders, lessons about survival, strength, and the ways of the land. His people had weathered storms much worse than this, had survived winters when the snow piled higher than their shelters. They had built their lives from the earth itself, using the resources it provided. Kaya's ancestors had known how to live with nature, not against it. They had taught him that survival wasn't just about physical strength, but about understanding the land and working with it. The fire sputtered, and Kaya leaned forward, adding another log to the flames. Ahuli moved quietly beside him, her face pale from the lack of sleep, but her eyes focused. The children had stirred once, but were now back to sleep, their small forms wrapped tightly in furs. Kaya's heart swelled with love and pride. These were his children, his legacy, and he would protect them no matter what. The storm outside seemed unrelenting, but Kaya knew this was not their first challenge. His people had faced much worse, and they had always found a way through. Kaya believed with every part of him that they would survive this storm, just as they had survived so many others. In the silence of the winter room, with the wind howling outside, Kaya whispered a quiet prayer to his ancestors. "Give us strength," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the storm. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the fire wrapping around him like a blanket. Whatever the storm had in store, Kaya was ready. The night wore on, the storm outside continuing its relentless assault. Kaya sat near the fire, his eyes watching the flickering flames, his thoughts focused on the family in the shelter. His children slept soundly, their small forms nestled in the warmth of furs, while Ahuli sat beside him, her eyes reflecting the fire's glow. They were safe for now. Kaya's thoughts, however, were not at ease. The bear had passed, but the storm raged on with increasing ferocity, and the cold. It seeped through every crack, every seam of the shelter, as though it too was searching for a way inside. Kaya had lived through many winters, but something about this storm felt different. The wind howled again, a shrill cry that sent a shiver down Kaya's spine. He stood up slowly, his muscles stiff from sitting too long, and moved toward the door. His instincts told him to check once more. Something about the night made him uneasy, though he couldn't say why. As he approached the door, a soft knock on the wood made his heart skip. His hand paused just inches from the doorframe. His breath caught in his chest. Who could be out there in this blizzard? No one in their right mind would venture into the storm. "Father?" Dakota's voice broke through the silence. Kaya turned to see his son sitting up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Is it the bear?" "No," Kaya said, trying to steady his breathing. He moved toward his son, placing a hand on his small shoulder. "It's something else." He moved back to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The knock had been faint, almost as if whoever it was didn't want to disturb them, but it was unmistakable. Kaya opened the door just enough to peer outside, the cold wind rushing in instantly, biting at his skin. Through the swirling snow, Kaya could barely make out the form of a man, stumbling toward the shelter. The figure was tall, hunched against the wind, struggling to remain upright. Kaya's instincts told him to stay inside, to keep the door shut. But the man was not just any traveler. He was a fellow Lakota. Kaya stepped outside, pulling his fur cloak tightly around him. The snow was thick, blurring his vision, but he could make out the man's face now. A man from the neighboring tribe. His name was Matto, a hunter who had often traded with Kaya's people. "Matto?" Kaya called out over the storm. "What are you doing out here?" Matto's breath came in ragged gasps, his face pale with exhaustion. "The storm. It took my lodge, my family, lost in the winds." He collapsed into Kaya's arms, and Kaya steadied him, dragging him inside. Ahuli stood, her expression softening at the sight of the wounded man. "Quickly, get him to the fire," she said. Kaya nodded and helped Matto to a place by the hearth. His heart raced. The storm had brought not only the cold, but a new challenge. The shelter, already strained, now had a new guest. Kaya knelt beside Matto, whose face was still pale, his body trembling with exhaustion and cold. Ahuli worked quickly, tending to his wounds and offering him the warmth of the fire. The storm outside raged with an intensity Kaya had never witnessed before, the wind howling like a wild beast, eager to consume everything in its path. Yet inside the shelter, they had what they needed: fire, food, and the strength of one another. But Kaya knew that this moment, this fragile peace, would not last. The storm's fury had already tested their endurance, and now, with Matto's unexpected arrival, their resources were stretched thin. Kaya's thoughts raced as he assessed their situation. They had enough firewood for a few more hours, perhaps a day, but with Matto's arrival, their already limited supply was in jeopardy. He turned to Ahuli, her face calm but etched with concern. "We must conserve everything," he said, his voice low. "The storm is not letting up. If we run out of food or warmth, we will not survive." Ahuli nodded, her hands steady as she moved to the pile of dried meat and root vegetables. They had enough food to last them through the storm if they rationed it carefully, but the task of keeping the fire burning was a greater challenge. The cold outside seemed to grow more intense with every passing hour, seeping into every crevice of their shelter. Kaya knew they could not afford to let the fire die. Matto stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Kaya, Ahuli." His voice was weak but filled with gratitude. "I thought I would not make it through the storm." Kaya nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. "You're safe now, Matto. We will help you through this." As the night wore on, the fire crackled low, but Kaya was determined. He rose from his spot by the hearth and walked over to the woodpile. He would take one last trip outside to gather more branches, anything to keep the flames alive. But before he could move, Ahuli placed a hand on his arm. "Be careful," she whispered. "The storm is deadly tonight." Kaya glanced out the small opening in the shelter, where the swirling snow blurred everything beyond. The wind was fierce, but Kaya's determination was stronger. The survival of his family and their guest depended on it. "I will return soon," he said, his voice steady. He stepped into the night, the cold instantly biting at his skin as the wind pushed against him. The snow was so thick that he could barely see a foot in front of him. But Kaya was no stranger to these harsh conditions. He knew the land, and he knew where to find what he needed. Every step was a battle, the wind trying to push him back, but Kaya pressed on. He moved with purpose, focused on the task ahead. He had to bring back enough wood to last them through the worst of the storm. There was no room for failure. The first light of dawn crept through the small cracks in the shelter, casting a faint glow on the stone walls. The storm, though still present, had lost some of its intensity. The wind howled less, and the snow had begun to settle, a quiet calm following the fierce fury of the night. Kaya sat by the now low fire, his eyes on the sleeping figures of his family and Matto, who had managed to regain some strength overnight. The night had been long and filled with uncertainty, but they had made it through. The fire had burned low at times, and the cold had crept into every corner of the room, but Kaya had kept it alive, adding what little wood they had left. Ahuli had rationed their food carefully, ensuring there was enough to sustain them for the next few days. But it had been a close call. Kaya stood and stretched, his stiff muscles protesting after the long night. He moved quietly across the room, careful not to disturb the others. The fire was still warm, but it wouldn't last much longer. Outside, the snowdrifts had piled high against the entrance, but Kaya knew that the storm would soon pass. They would need to venture out for supplies, but the land outside was unforgiving. He could feel it, the weight of the storm still in the air, the chill that would not soon fade. Ahuli stirred, and Kaya turned to see her rise from her spot by the fire. She moved with quiet grace, her eyes meeting his. "Is it over?" she asked softly. "For now," Kaya replied, his voice steady but weary. "We survived the night." Ahuli nodded and moved toward their children, brushing a lock of hair from Naya's face as she stirred. Lakota still slept soundly, unaware of the dangers they had faced. Kaya watched them, his heart full of gratitude. They were safe, but Kaya knew that survival was never guaranteed. The world was harsh, and nature's fury could strike without warning. Their survival was a testament to their strength, but it was also a reminder of how fragile life could be. Matto awoke, his face pale, but no longer strained with the exhaustion he had felt the night before. He sat up slowly, his eyes meeting Kaya's. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I didn't think I'd make it." Kaya gave him a reassuring nod. "You're strong, Matto. You've made it through. We all have." The storm had broken, but the world outside was still cold and unforgiving. Kaya knew they had no choice but to leave the shelter soon. The snow had piled high against the door, but Kaya was confident they could clear it, and then they would be able to gather the supplies they needed to last the rest of the winter. As he looked out the entrance, Kaya knew that the storm had tested them, but they had passed. And in the end, it was not just their strength that had kept them alive, but the wisdom passed down through generations, the wisdom of his people.